Gwen, over to you now. I'm just going to let you crack on.
Brilliant, thank you. So I'll give a very brief introduction to how to run language learning experiments with adults and children using online methods, because there's lots of other people giving very interesting talks today. So this is very much just an introduction. Now, before I dive into that, I'll first explain what I mean by language learning experiments. And generally, what I'm talking about there is a task in which your participants learn a part of a language. Now, this may be part of their native language, but it could also be foreign language or an artificial language that you created specifically for the experiment. And generally speaking, after teaching them part of this or after training them on it, you want to test to see how much they've learned. Now, this might also mean that you end up having multiple sessions, as Emma nicely introduced earlier, because learning tends to take time. So to be able to measure some learning, you want to make sure people have learned something. And generally speaking, these kind of studies are behavioral in the sense that people are clicking things, typing responses, or maybe saying things out loud. But there's mostly behavioral things going on here. And to start with the take-home message and the good news in this sense, it's fairly straightforward to transfer these type of experiments to online methods. And today I'll talk to you about two ways of doing this. Firstly, about fully online testing with adults, and then also about in-person testing with online methods, but testing children. Now, generally, when you're thinking about transferring your lab-based study online, you want to answer the key question of how much experimental involvement will you have had in the lab. If the answer is not very much, beyond sort of giving consent forms and instructions, that should all be fairly easy to implement. If there's more involved, or you have more than one person at a time, or there's a confederate involved, anything like that, it probably is still possible. You just need to think about things a little more before you start setting things up. Now, general considerations for any kind of online testing that you want to think about is, as was already mentioned, you need to check people are paying attention and that your data quality is all right. Jenny Ward has a talk on that later. And if you're using auditory stimuli, for instance, like speech samples, which you would do in language learning tasks, you want to make sure people are wearing headphones if that's relevant. There's a really good paper on this, and more on this also comes back in the online auditory research session in the afternoon. Now, challenges you might come across when doing online testing compared to lab testing is that the instructions need to be clear and stand alone, because people need to be able to do the task without asking you questions. If this is too difficult in terms of having full-on text, particularly when you're testing children, you might want to consider having video instructions if that makes things clearer. Then you want to think about the fact that the environment is only relatively quiet. So if you need full soundproof booth, make sure people are wearing headphones if they need to listen to anything. That kind of thing is something you need to think about. And you really want to pilot your study, as was already mentioned before, and as will come back later. Particularly also with kids, you want to again check task demands and testing time, because they may be different for online studies than what you're used to for lab-based kind of studies there. And as Emma already showed, you'll likely need more people online testing than in a lab-based setup. How many more depends on your selection criteria, and I'll give you an example for this now. So my first online study was a study in which I had English native speakers learn Dutch vowels and learn to tell apart the Dutch vowels. And what really helped me in this case is that this first study was actually a replication of a lab-based study. So I knew that the task was working with those participants or that age group. And then I also had a rough idea of what the results were going to look like, which really helps in sort of expecting, trying to figure out how online testing worked. And helpfully, I also replicated the pattern of results. So you can see the lab-based version on the left and the online ones on the right. It gives you the same pattern of results for this particular task. There is a little bit more variation, but this really depends on what kind of thing you're doing. Now, in terms of sample size, I'll give you a bit of a different story than what Emma did, but that's purely because of different reasons here. So in the lab, it took me about a month of testing to get to 48 people. And online, this took me less than 2 hours, but part of this was really due to exclusion criteria. So this was a one-session study, about half an hour of actual participant time, And all I really cared about was that participants didn't speak Dutch, which turns out is quite a large group of people. So it's fairly easy to keep track of people and not have too much data loss if you only release the task to very few participants at a time. Now, when you're moving things to working with children, it might be trickier to implement things as fully online studies because children might require some supervision to do the tasks. More on this again in today's afternoon session on testing kids. But my experience comes from using online methods, but in-person testing in schools, which might help you in transferring to semi-supervised online testing, where someone might be able to help the children out. Now, you might wonder why use online methods for this in the first place. If you are in the school, you could just use your custom-built methods that you would normally use. Online methods actually give you more flexibility because they resolve issues with installing software on the computers of whoever you're testing on. Particularly in schools, that is quite handy because you either might not be able to install software or the person who has the admin password to allow you the software installation isn't there on the day that you're there, which means it's quite tricky to get the software on there in the first place. And then also a setup example of one of my testing sessions in a school was like this. With 30 laptops from the school themselves. So having online methods meant they could all just get to the website and start without me having to go to all laptops to install the software there. This also really helps you potentially in the current situation because the fact that they could just go to the website and start means that if I'd given the instructions to a teacher, TA, or a parent or a carer, they could have run the study as well beyond me being there. So this might be something that you could use right now. Now, going back to having multiple sessions, as I mentioned, this is something that you might have in language research because you want to measure learning, and learning tends to take some time, so it's quite common. But there are many ways of designing multiple sessions. There's many reasons for having them, and because of this, there's also many ways of implementing them. The best option really depends on your needs, and they may be platform dependent. All of the examples I'll give in the next few slides of how to design this are focusing on Gorilla and on testing in schools with kids. So in that situation I just showed you. The first and potentially most obvious way of implementing this is having a delay node in Gorilla, which is essentially like adding a task into your experiment that just has a set time limit during which your participants can't go on to the next task. So that automatically arranges how long they have to wait for. It's useful in online testing because it needs less researcher input, though Emma just showed you that there's quite a lot involved still. But given that if you have a straightforward design, it's fairly easy to implement this in the task setup itself in terms of design. And it allows you to have different tasks in each session because they're completely independent of each other and you're just adding an extra task. You do need to think about counterbalancing if that's the thing that's relevant for you and how to build that in around the delay node. Now, another thing you could do is having different experiments for each session. So in that case, you would still have different tasks on each session because they're completely independent experiments, but you would need extra researcher intervention or supervision. So you'd need to, in your follow-up email where you remind people, make clear that actually there's a new link for this task for this day, or in school, which is where I use this, if you have different sessions each day, before the child comes to you to do the task, you set up the task for them so that they don't realize there's a different experiment. And this is particularly a helpful way of designing things if you need more manual control over counterbalancing. So for instance, if there's differences in counterbalancing on each session. Then the final option that I've used is to have the same experiment, but use a new participant code each session where the code indicates what session they're on. And this is something which you could use if your sessions are identical, because you're using the same experiment, so they're going to get the same tasks. But again, it does need that extra level of researcher intervention of sending up the right information. And it does give you more manual control over counterbalancing in return. So there's that trade-off here. Now, an important factor for all of these ways of designing it is to think about your exclusion criteria, specifically related to having multiple sessions. It was already mentioned earlier in Emma's talk, but particularly the kind of questions you want to ask for multiple sessions is also, can participants miss out on a session and still continue your study? And can they miss part of a session and still continue? And if the answer is yes to either of these, how much can they actually miss? So what I used as an example is I included people if they completed more than 60% of my training, particularly for this study. But this may vary for you. And this also raises the question of when do you actually exclude people? So do you exclude people at the point when they miss something, or do you exclude them at the end after they've sort of complete the whole thing and you just see how much they've missed out on and decide based on that? Now, I'll give you an example of one particular study that I worked on and my reasoning behind choosing the way I set this up. This was a study with Dutch children where I taught them English vowels through means of a multi-session training study, and it also had a pre and post test design. So there were multiple reasons for having multiple sessions, sorry. And I had 8 identical training sessions beyond the pre and post test. I had 24 counterbalance versions for stimuli related reasons. You can see some of them here. And I was testing in a school environment, as I mentioned earlier, so I was there to supervise. But I was also dealing with a changeable class schedule, so there was no consistent testing time, and it made having a fixed time delay a bit more tricky. Now, while all of these were important factors, the key deciding factor for me was actually that some children didn't fully finish a session. So in the time slot that we had at the end, they might have been a bit slow and didn't make it to the end of a session before they had to go on to maths class, or they might have missed a session if they were ill for a day. And they still needed to continue to be in line with everyone else in the class. So everyone needed to do session 3 on day 3, regardless of whether they'd fully completed the previous one. Now, this was something that, if I'd set it up automatically, wouldn't have quite worked without manual intervention, because in Gorilla, I told sort of added a delay node and told it to at least wait 12 hours. If people don't complete the previous session or the previous task, they don't get to that delay node, so it doesn't know that it needs to continue people on. This would have been fixable with manual intervention, but just to remind you that this was the situation I was testing in. It was in school, about 30 children at a time, an entire class, and I was testing about 100 children in a span of 2.5 weeks, so it would have been really time consuming to manually fix this for every participant that may not have finished the session. So in the end, instead of going about it that way, I used the same experiment with a new participant code each day, which meant I could continue people on even if they missed out on part of a session or an entire session by just giving them a new code. And that meant I tested 58 7-year-olds and 51 11-year-olds in a span of 2 and a bit weeks. But afterwards, I had to exclude data depending on how much of the training they'd completed. And I predetermined these exclusion criteria, which you can find in my pre-registration on the OSF if you want to have a look at that. So just to summarize my points, if you have a language learning type of experiment, you can generally transfer these type of tasks online fairly readily. You have the same kind of considerations for any kind of online testing if you're working with adults, but if you're working with children, there might be more to think about, particularly about supervision and task demands. And online methods really give you flexibility you might not otherwise have, also in ways of coding multiple sessions. And that is it. Thank you.
Great job. Thanks, Gwen. Really interesting. I particularly like the, I think that there's a tendency for us to think, oh, well, you know, in time of COVID and lockdown, we're doing all these online experiments because that's the only option. But in fact, using these tools in things like a school environment, I mean, you made a really compelling case. Were you doing that originally? Like at what point did you think, oh, right, if I use, you know, tools like Gorilla, I can actually simplify the testing process in schools?
So originally, I've done a few studies that were mainly one-session studies in schools using non-online platforms, where I brought in my own laptop and set up the experiment, but I only have one testing laptop. Right. And then I realized I had to do a multi-session study of about 8 sessions, and the school did have laptops that I could use, and they had a very narrow time span in which I could be in the school. So having to be in the school for 3 weeks and trying to test 100 kids would have not been possible if I just came in with my one laptop. So Gorilla really helped out there in trying to make things a lot more flexible in that sense.
No, I can see how that would be incredibly valuable, because I imagine you were looking at that thinking, oh my God, I'm going to be 60 by the time the data collection's done, and these kids will have graduated.
Exactly. It was just me testing. I'm not multiplying myself in any way, so that would have been impossible.
Well, it's fantastic to see it as what amounts to sort of a force multiplier. Then it gives you the opportunity to supervise and maintain that platform integrity while using the tools that are there. I love that. It's a really great example. I can